Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm really glad to see a good turnout. This is not our regularly scheduled time for lectures. This is our occasional lecture series, which means not regularly scheduled time, basically. Please turn off your cell phone before the talk begins today because we are recording the talk. And I'd like to just introduce our speaker, Bruce Dickson. He's a professor of political science and international affairs and director of the Score Center for Asian Studies at George Washington University. He received his BA in political science and English literature, his MA in Chinese studies, and his PhD in political science, all from the University of Michigan, which meant you were here for how long? 20 years?
Not continuously.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't one long stretch.
Okay. He joined the faculty of the George Washington University and the Elliott School in 1993. His research focuses on the political dynamics in China, particularly the adaptability of the Chinese Communist Party and the regime that it governs. His current research examines the political consequences of economic reform in China and the Chinese Communist Party's evolving strategy for survival, which he will be speaking on today. He's published several books. His first book was on democratization in China and Taiwan. He's also published 2 books on the relationship between the party and private capital, Red Capitalists and Wealth into Power. And he will be speaking today on his book that was just published this year by Oxford University Press, The Dictator's Dilemma, the Chinese Communist Party's Strategy for Survival. Please join me in welcoming him. Thank you.
First, I want to thank Mary for inviting me here today. It's always a pleasure to be back in Ann Arbor. It's always, when people find out I've gotten 3 degrees from the same school, there's always this look of pity on their face, like, you couldn't get anywhere else? And I remember when I was deciding whether to come back to U of M for my PhD, my undergraduate advisor and one of my master's advisors was Ellen Whiting, who was here for a long time as a professor. At that point, had semi-retired and moved out to Arizona. And I said, okay, I've got these offers from these different schools. Where should I go? And he said, well, you've done everything in China studies at U of M, but you've never done political science there. So why don't you go back there? So I followed his advice and didn't really regret it. So it was a great place to be in school and a great place to return to whenever I can. The talk today is from this book called The Dictator's Dilemma, which is formally being published next month and will be available a few weeks after that. And this is the first time I've given this version of the talk. I've spoken on different aspects of the larger project in different ways, but it's kind of the first time sort of laying out some of the broad themes from it. Over on the table, academics are used to selling our ideas, but not actually used to selling our books. But this sheet here, there's a 30% discount if you order with the code on this sheet. You can get a hardback for only $19.60. So with graduation coming up and Mother's Day soon after that, no end of possibilities. So for people who study China or are from China or travel and visit there, the themes of the book may not seem all that surprising. What I'm going to talk about is the idea that the Communist Party does not face imminent demise the way many scholars have argued or predicted. Throughout the post-Mao period of reform, there's been anticipation that the party will not be able to survive economic reform, it won't be able to survive globalization, it won't be able to survive one thing or another, and yet it always has. So this in part is designed to tap into the debate about whether or not the Communist Party in China is adaptable or even resilient on the one hand, or if it is fragile and in danger of imminent collapse, the way other people have discussed. What is original in the book is not so much the broad themes, but the survey data that underlies the argument that I put forward in it. And there are 2 nationwide surveys that were done in 2010 and 2014, coming 2 years before and 2 years after the change of leadership that took place at the 18th Party Congress in 2012, these surveys kind of provide a before and after picture of public opinion before and after the Xi Jinping era. So kind of look at some degree of public opinion change and continuity across these relatively short period of years, but important years in terms of both leadership and economic and other kind of policy changes. In short here, the party's survival strategy, which is the subtitle of the book, focuses on three different things. And this is not unique to China. This is the case for just about any authoritarian regime. To stay in power, they have to rely upon some combination of repression, of dealing with real or perceived threats from within society. And I'll talk about that issue first. Different aspects of legitimation or what the regime does to try and generate popular support. It doesn't want to just rely upon coercion and repression. It wants to actually generate support in different ways and through economic development, rising living standards, the promotion of certain values, changes in the way in which the party governs society, designed to try and elicit popular support and not just rule with a heavy hand. And third, they rely upon some degree of co-optation in terms of who they let into the political system, into the political process, and who gets excluded. And this has been a dilemma that the party has faced really from its inception about who can it trust to be members of the party, who present potential threats to the party that need to not just be pushed out of the political system, but repressed in different ways so their voices cannot even be heard. But it does want to incorporate different sets of elites, different types of talent into the party for different purposes. We don't know exactly what combination of these three things is optimal. It would be, you know, if we had a nice equation for what balance between these three parts of its strategy would be most effective, we'd be able to predict much better which authoritarian regimes were fragile and which ones are likely to endure. And autocrats themselves don't know what combination of these things is necessary or which ones may be a threat to its survival. And that's what the title of the book refers to as the dictator's dilemma. Autocrats don't really know, can't really predict with certainty which of these strategies will be successful, which ones that may have a short-term fix to problems that they identify may create long-term problems for them, and therefore, whether or not what they're trying to do in the immediate sense will have long-lasting benefits or creating long-term problems that they'll have to face in the future. So with that, I'm going to kind of walk through some of the key aspects of these three different parts of the survival strategy, and with it incorporate some of the survey data to kind of show how it plays out. Much of what we read about in the Western media has to do lately with different aspects of repression, about different protests and how they're handled, the crackdown on lawyers, more recently on churches, on different voices that have either a critical or a dissenting view about politics in China. And many scholars have said that given how strongly the party represses civil society, how limited the autonomy of these groups are, that essentially China has no civil society. And yet, there are over 500,000 registered NGOs in the country. It's estimated there's at least twice that many unregistered but active civil society organizations in the country. Many of them are now partnering with local governments to provide different types of public goods, such as education, job retraining, legal advice, and so on, as ways to benefit society in one way or another, but that are doing so as a way of supporting the regime's survival, not posing a threat to it. The people who are active in civil society in China face a double challenge. On the one hand, even the ones who are not political in what they do face skepticism from local officials, about what they may be up to and constant scrutiny about their operations and their activities. That skepticism is also matched by many people in Chinese society who don't really trust what NGOs are up to or even understand what they can do. In previous studies of China, whether through ethnographic work or survey work, one of the consistent findings is how little trust there is of people outside of your immediate family and perhaps your close friends. And also that the amount of trust that you have in party and government officials declines noticeably as you go from the central level, where there's relatively high trust in central officials and the key institutions, lower for provincial level, lower for city and county level, and even lower for township officials. NGOs are trusted even less. The level of trust for NGOs is just a little bit above perfect strangers. In other words, there's not a lot of trust at all in what these groups are up to. So not only is the state alert to what they may be doing and repressive in different ways to prevent a potential, any kind of potential threat that it may pose, but they don't even get much support from the people they're trying to help. And so it's a particular oddity. There's criticism of the party's crackdown on civil society, but at the same time, it's not clear that other people in society are all that worried about it because they themselves are skeptical about what these groups may be up to. Similarly, there's been attention to crackdown and dissent on true political activists, democracy promoters, of which there are very few in existence, either in jail or in exile or otherwise forced into being quiet. I'm not going to present this aspect of it here, but one of the curious things is that when you ask people in China, how democratic is China today, most people say it is increasingly democratic. That over time there's been a growing level of democracy in the country, and that most people are satisfied with the level of democracy that currently exists in China. Now, they don't define it in terms of elections and competitive parties and rule of law and so on, you know, how you select leaders and how you hold them accountable. They define it more in terms of what the state does for them, what it provides in terms of policies and public goods and so on. So as long as the state is doing things on their behalf, governing in their interests, they see it as increasingly democratic. The fact that they can travel, there's more mobility in the country, less control over their personal lives, again is seen as an indicator of greater democracy in the country. So when President Obama or other Western leaders criticize the party for not being democratic enough, this often is confusing to people in China because they see growing levels of democracy. What's wrong with these people who are criticizing our government? Because they're working with a different definition of it, as a consequence, interpret it, the progress in different ways. Third area that's getting a lot of attention in recent years has been censorship, especially over the internet. And this has clearly been a key part of the party's strategy, controlling the flow of information, what is available, who has access to it, and so on. And there's this assumption, or perhaps this image conveyed, that information is carefully scrutinized, access to it is carefully controlled, and that it creates tremendous frustration by people within China about the lack of free access to information. However, when you ask people about their experience with censorship, you get a rather different picture. So, first of all, about half of the people these are in urban areas of the country, not including rural areas, which are usually treated separately. But in urban China, about half of the population is not online at all. These are people who are usually older, less educated. The usual, my parents are not very much online either. So it's similar trends within China about who is and who is not online. People who are online, the largest group of them say that they don't experience censorship when they're online. And only little more than 10, almost 15% encounter it on somewhere between a rare and frequent basis. That's because most people go online in China are not looking for political information, are not looking at airing grievances. They're playing games, they're checking their email, they're following celebrities, they're doing things that many people do outside. The people who do want to cross the red line of Chinese politics, they may encounter censorship, but in the larger scheme of people online, it's a surprisingly small number that say they encounter it. The more important question, though, is what is your reaction when you face it? What emotional response do you have when you encounter censorship? The most common answer, it doesn't matter, which suggests that they're so used to it by now that they've just resigned to the fact that they can't get full access to information and just learn to lump it instead of challenging it. There is a significant group of people who say they're angry about it. These are the people that get the most attention, especially by journalists, because they are quite angry about it in some cases. I had a former student of mine who would say that she always considered herself very patriotic, except when she went online. And then she'd get so mad. And for people who are angry about it, it does have a big impact on the degree to which how they assess the regime as a whole. So in the larger scheme, if this is the range of Chinese society, about half of them are not online. Of the ones who are online, most of them don't encounter censorship. The ones who do encounter censorship, only a little bit are angry about it. We have this notion that everybody is angry about censorship, and in fact, that's not what the people themselves often report. What has changed is that the range of people who are now exposed to censorship, so particularly expats, foreign businessmen, scholars, students who used to rely upon VPNs, which no longer work as well as they used to, people who used to be able to evade the Great Firewall are now being caught by it, and journalists as well. And so it may be that the people who are being exposed to it are reacting now in ways they didn't used to. And this is part of the issue I mentioned about dilemma, about how will people react to the different parts of the party's strategy. The more people that get exposed to repressive tactics who don't pose a threat, but may react as my former student did, who would otherwise be patriotic, but when she's exposed to censorship, her feelings would change dramatically. If you overreact, overly do censorship, the response may not be constraining public opinion and threats, but in fact creating more frustration, at least for the people who do feel angry about it. A fourth area of what I put under the category of repression has to do with corruption. It doesn't fit in quite as neatly as the other types of repression I just talked about, but in this case, there are people, if you have to give bribes, you obviously feel that you are not being treated fairly, and in order to get things done, you have to pay a bribe. And now the people who are being investigated for corruption themselves are now facing the very repressive, heavy-handed tactics that the state provides to even top party and government officials and now military officials who are charged with corruption. It has been a prominent theme of the Xi Jinping era, is the ongoing anti-corruption campaign. Public opinion about this is interesting to show what change has taken place as a consequence of the change of leaders and Xi's new priorities. In the 2010 survey, before the campaign started, people were more or less evenly divided between whether they thought corruption was getting better, getting worse, or about the same. In 2014, 2 years into the campaign, the vast majority of people saw it getting better. At the local level, they could see that the number of limos going up and down the streets, the banquets, the more ostentatious lifestyles by local officials and their children had noticeably changed and diminished. So if you're Xi Jinping, this is good news. You're pushing a campaign and people see the benefits of it. On the other hand, it also tarnishes the party's reputation. In asking how widespread do you think corruption is? In the 2010 survey, less than half of the people thought that it was particularly common at the central level. As a consequence of this campaign, which does target very high-level officials, party, government, military officials, now almost 70% of the people think it's commonplace, even at the central level. The old rule was you don't go after top-level officials. She has gotten rid of that old rule and now exposed it more and more. At the local level, there wasn't that much change. People always thought local officials were pretty corrupt, and they haven't changed their view that much about the local officials, but the change for central is quite prominent. So even though the campaign might be good for Xi himself because people identify him with it and the success of it, but it's bad for the party's reputation as a whole. So, you know, this is the dilemma that most regimes face about dealing with corruption. In order to really tackle it, you have to expose it. And by exposing it, you show how prevalent it is. So on the one hand, you may seem like you're creating more legitimacy by showing you're cracking down on something, but you're also revealing how terribly widespread the problem was in the first place. And many regimes choose to simply bury the information rather than expose it and have public opinion turn cynical about it. So that's one area of the party's strategy, which looks at areas of repression. The second area has to do with legitimation, and particularly the first and most important is economic growth. Probably the most frequently repeated mantra about the party's legitimacy is it's based largely on economic development. And this is often seen as why the party needs to create at least an 8% growth rate. A few years ago, they got rid of that target, but for a long time, they had to have at least an 8% growth rate. Local officials were encouraged to promote growth well beyond that. And you can see the graph on the left shows that it had spiked up to 14% before its recent decline. This is obviously, this particular chart is itself a bit old. It is forecasting development by now that is a couple points above what it really is. But nevertheless, the thought was it was the overall economic growth that was the source of the party's legitimacy. In the literature on American politics, there's often a debate about what influences electoral results. Is it the aggregate economic conditions, what are often referred to as sociotropic conditions, or is it the individual pocketbook factors? And the second chart here illustrates rising levels of per capita income. And it's the assumption also that these two things tend to go together. So that as the economy in China has been slowing in recent years, predictions that this is presenting a potential crisis of legitimacy for the party, which could, you know, unravel public support for it. But individual incomes don't rise and fall at the same pace and at the same time as the aggregate economy does. During China's boom years, individual incomes were not rising nearly as fast as the overall economy was growing. And as the economy is now slowing, individual incomes are not necessarily falling. So this asks a question of, now compared to 5 years ago, what is your level of family income? And there's virtually no difference between the two surveys. If anything, a slight increase in the more recent survey, well into the period where the economy had slowed down. If you ask people how optimistic they are about the future, again, just as optimistic now or in 2014, public opinion can change very quickly. It's now 2016. But at the end of 2014, when these results were collected, people were assessing their recent improvements of income very positively, were optimistic about the future. And that is not the kind of conditions under which you expect wide-scale ferment for change and even the support for revolutionary change. So as long as the party can handle this difficult challenge of making sure that incomes continue to grow, individuals can believe that they're prospering and their aspirations are rising. Even though the economy is slowing, the slowing overall economic growth rate does not need to be a threat to the party's legitimacy. If anything, it may enhance it, because most people, the heavy-handed tactics often done to promote growth also undermine popular support for the party, the incessant land grabs, things that were done to boost development. If those can be discontinued and they kind of shift how they generate growth, it may be advantageous to the party's reputation, at the same time allowing incomes to continue to rise. That is, however, a tricky combination to pull off to make sure incomes do continue to rise, that unemployment does not become to be a problem again, and that people don't become more cynical about the future. In addition to sort of material factors, the party's also been promoting a variety, a set of values to help support itself. Simply providing material benefits isn't enough. It also wants to inculcate certain values within society. One of the debates in recent years has been whether or not rising levels of nationalism in the country are sort of indigenous and popularly motivated, or to what degree they're mobilized by the state. And one thing that we find in the different ways of asking different types of questions about being either patriotic or having more of an assertive anti-foreign viewpoint, is that the people who feel patriotic, waving the flags on the left-hand side, and the ones who are bashing Japanese cars on the other, they're not the same set of people. And in the United States, people who are patriotic tend to also be nationalistic, and vice versa. In China, there seem to be separate, these are separate strands, overlap quite a bit, but not all people with strong patriotic viewpoints are the ones who are also willing to take more assertive steps against what they perceive to be foreign insults or foreign actions against the interests of China. This is one of the dilemmas that the party faces, is exactly to what extent it wants to promote nationalism through education, through the media, and through other things, because it has also been the basis for large-scale popular protests in the country, which often then snowballed into something else, new demands or new issues, new criticisms get raised that are unrelated to the nationalist dispute at hand. Andy Nathan and Andrew Scobell have argued that nationalism is the only legitimate form of dissent in contemporary China, because the party can't really crack down on nationalist statements, even if they're critical of the government, for fear of stoking a stronger reaction. So a dilemma on the one hand, trying to create a sense of patriotism without becoming a target of more nationalistic anti-foreign sentiments. A second key area of promoting new sets of, or a different set of values, has to do with the current embrace of Confucianism in the country. China's leaders, in different ways, have always drawn upon the Chinese past to legitimate much of what many of their policies are. First expression up on the upper right, seek truth from facts, is associated most of all with Deng Xiaoping in the reform era, but he didn't come up with it. It was first identified with Chairman Mao above his home in Yan'an. These words were written. We don't think of Mao being often don't think of being a great pragmatist, but he himself had a very pragmatic streak and a very idealistic streak. And so he often promoted more idealistic, more pragmatic elements this phrase didn't begin with Mao, for that matter, either. It was originally from I'm forgetting now. It's either from the Book of Han or from Mencius. But it had a long pedigree in the country that began long before the Communist Party was formed in the 1920s, and long before Deng Xiaoping once again championed the phrase to legitimize the reform efforts. Each of the Chinese leaders have coined different phrases, again, drawing back into Chinese history as a way of legitimizing what they're doing. Xi Jinping's notion of a China dream doesn't have Confucian origins per se, but it does harken back to the goal from the 19th century and perhaps earlier about creating a strong, prosperous, wealthy country. The China dream is very different from the American dream. The American dream is anybody through hard work and effort can rise from poverty to wealth through their own efforts. It's a very individually oriented dream. The China dream has less to do with individuals and much to do with the country as a whole. So the goal is to make the country strong, to make the country rich. And your efforts are designed to make that goal more possible, not necessarily that you yourself would be, the goal is not for you to become wealthy and prosperous and successful, it's that you make the country that way. In the surveys that were done for this project, there's different ways of looking at different Confucian traditions. It can be about meritocracy, it can be about self-improvement, it can be about adherence to orthodoxy. We had a series of questions about the degree to which, more so at the social level, to the degree to which children should obey their parents, that when there's dispute, you should seek the advice of elders in the community and so on. So much more sort of a social level, not a political dimension of Confucianism, but more of a social level. And what we found here was that, when I say we, it was part of a larger team of people, and I just, the book is my book, but the ideas for it and kind of carried out in discussion of much of it was really much a collaborative effort, and I've benefited a lot from the research team I work with in China to carry this out. What we found was that the people who were most inclined to agree with these kind of Confucian sentiments about social hierarchies were people who had urban hukou and who had hukou in the cities in which they were currently living. The people who had migrated into the cities, either from the countryside or from other cities, people who were separated from their original social network, who didn't have people to rely upon in the way that a traditional families might, they had the lowest support for these types of Confucian values because adherence to the social hierarchy was not as relevant for them because they were removed from that original hierarchy. So it's a curious case that we don't think of migrant workers being the leading edge of modernization, but in terms of changing traditional values, they seem to be the least traditional, even though they had rural origins. Living in the cities and the experience they had made them more skeptical about simply adhering to the traditional hierarchy that they've faced. A third area of values the party's been trying to promote has been about maintaining stability. And it has both been actively repressing threats or protests before they escalate. Been talking a lot about the need to maintain stability as a way of achieving economic and other goals. And it turns out that this fear of instability that the party promotes resonates with many people in society. So here are three different either types of groups or activities that could be a threat to local stability. And in each case, there was a slight increase between 2010 and 2014 in terms of degree to which people saw a potential multiple party system within the country, diverse social groups at the local level, or public demonstrations, leading to wider instability in the country, and in that sense, support for the party's goal of nipping these things in the bud so they don't present a bigger source of conflict and instability. So even though there's been criticism within the country, criticism abroad about the party's intolerance of protests, even peaceful protests, there's not the same sense of outrage throughout much of Chinese society that also see these trends as being a potential threat to stability. This may, in fact, be more the success of the party's propaganda efforts to show that these things could be a threat. But even if that's the case, they've created an environment in which cracking down on both peaceful and violent protest is seen as acceptable to many in society. So the third area I mentioned of the party's strategy for survival has to do with cooptation, who it recruits into the party. This has been a prominent theme of elite politics throughout much of the party's existence. A lot of the politics during the Maoist period turned on who should be recruited, who should be promoted to official positions. And that debate has continued in more muted form, but still in contemporary China. In asking people, why do you join the party? What were your reasons for joining the party? It really depends upon how old you are, what cohort you belong to. So for the people who are joining the party now, people referred to it in the post-92 generation, the people who came of age after 1992, the main reason they joined the party was it was helpful to their career. It was very self-serving, self-interested. Any of you who are, know people who have joined the party, or maybe you yourself joined the party, this seems to be the prominent reason that, and people are quite open about it. It's one more credential that you accrue in the course of, in many cases, your college education. Chinese colleges are the main source now of party members and have been so for at least a decade. The idea that you're joining the party because you believe, this gets truncated, that only the party can lead China to prosperity, or that you want to work for communism. For younger cohorts, this does not really motivate them to join the party. They're doing it for the benefits that it brings to them. It used to be early in the Reform era that there was a certain stigma attached to being a party member, and if it was known you're a party member, you may have a hard time finding a job, especially among foreign firms. That seems to have changed. When you realize that Walmart, who is not otherwise known as being pro-union, allows its workers in China to be unionized, and allows a Communist Party organization to be in place in its operations in China, you realize that the situation is quite different. What party membership means is quite different in contemporary China. In some ways, it means that you've been screened, you've been vetted. You have no skeletons in the closet, as we would put it in the West, and it's just seen as that you're a good scout. And if you've also got a good college degree and other credentials, party membership can in fact make it easier to get hired, even by foreign companies, than in the past. The dilemma here is whether or not the party can trust the people that join the party now to be loyal supporters in the future. And interviewing with people in charge of recruitment on college campuses, this is a huge dilemma for them. Who do you believe when they tell you that they really are loyal people and they're joining for all the right reasons? If they guess wrong and this person then becomes a troublemaker, they could be in trouble. And so they're very cautious about who they let in. for local officials who have a target of promoting the economy, if you surpass your target, you get rewarded. If you're a party recruiter, you have a hard cap. If you go over your limit, you get in big trouble because party leaders believe the party has gotten too big. They want to, if not shrink it, at least keep it from growing quite so fast. It now has over 90 million, or almost 90 million members. And informally, there's the thought going around in recent years, they don't want to exceed 100 million, because that just is a threshold that they don't want to go across, but it's getting closer and closer to that. So they want to be careful about who they let in and make sure that they behave loyally. If you ask questions about, who votes, party members are almost twice as likely to vote than non-party members. If you ask who donates to charitable organizations, who volunteers to do volunteer work, party members, again, much more likely. Some of them might just be good citizens, but more commonly, the party mobilizes them to demonstrate their loyalty to the party by voting, by making donations, by volunteering to do unpleasant work, so that they show to other people as party members that they are doing things and setting examples for others to follow. So to kind of wrap things up, there's several different elements of conventional wisdom that these results and others in the book look at. One is that economic growth is the primary basis for the party's legitimacy. In a larger sort of multivariate statistical analysis, GDP, levels of GDP and GDP growth have no impact on different ways of measuring regime support, but individual incomes do. Individually strong predictors of regime support is how well you are doing yourself, which means as the party is slow, as the economy is slowing, that need not be a crisis for the party, assuming it's a soft landing and assuming that people remain optimistic about the future. Second of all, I mentioned as the party relies primarily through repression on staying in power, but also does a variety of things to promote support, more popular support, not simply using their heavy-handed tactics. In the book, I go into more detail about the different ways in which civil society is active in the country, but in more select areas, often at the periphery of things. But nevertheless, if these types of groups can be successful, and these are business associations, groups that are organized to support migrant workers in terms of education and healthcare and so on, about groups that are designed to provide charity relief in the case of emergencies. If these groups can be successful, then they take some of the pressure off of the party and the government to deliver those things. So just as we see civil society being the basis of a stable democracy, the same types of groups, if they're active in China, could also produce stability there as well. It's the more politically active ones that challenge the state that we normally think of as being the only legitimate civil society in a country like China, that if you're not politically motivated, you're not in opposition to the state, you're not truly civil society. But we don't have that same notion for groups that exist in other type of regimes. And lastly, that the Chinese society has gotten fed up with the party, lost hope in its ability to govern and to reform, and ready for democracy. This was a prominent theme leading up to the 18th Party Congress in a lot of the Western coverage of China. And in fact, there are certainly people who are fed up with the party. There are certainly people who would like to create a democratic regime tomorrow, if not sooner. But not everybody is quite that forceful about things or quite that articulate about things. So why does this all matter? couple different ways in which this is of interest not just to China specialists, but more broadly. One is that there have been people looking at the prospects for regime change in China as well as other authoritarian regimes, and the assumption has often been that the alternative to an authoritarian regime is a democracy. But increasingly what we see is the alternative is another authoritarian regime, often an unstable regime. And again, this is using anecdotes from my students, which is probably unfair, but many of them look at Russia, higher level of income, lower levels of corruption. They wouldn't trade their situation for Russia in a second, because they see Russia as being so poorly governed that they feel they're much better off than the alternative. As people look at what happened in the Middle East and Northern Africa after the 2011 uprisings, again, it's sort of not much inspiration for them. The debates among China specialists about the party's future and its endurability has been a prominent theme, one of the more prominent themes in the study of Chinese politics for a couple of decades, much of which is posed more on what people would prefer to happen than on what is actually happening on the ground. And a lot of the my colleagues who are promoting the idea that democracy is likely in the country is much more based upon what they would prefer to see happen in China as opposed to how likely it actually may be. They're not here to give the other side, so I'm distorting their viewpoint to make it simple. But nevertheless, this has been an ongoing debate for years and will remain a debate as long as the party stays in power, I'm sure. And lastly, the practical significance of it. This is of interest not just to scholars and journalists, but in terms of what especially the U.S. government and other governments do in terms of dealing with regimes that they don't particularly like. The idea that some regimes are just thirsty for change, that if you could simply get rid of the current leaders, a stable liberal democracy would magically appear. This seems to be that used to be a very prominent theme, I think less so given the results of the past 10 or 15 years of American foreign policy. But nevertheless, important to understand that the values that policymakers and scholars and perhaps journalists hold dear may be not the same ones that travel well in other situations. So with that, we get back to the beginning and be happy to take your questions or comments. Thank you. Mary.
So I have a lot of questions, but I'll just ask one question, or it's sort of two questions, but it's related. So when you talked about the predictors of support for the regime, and you mentioned individual income, so I was wondering if that was really the only significant effect that you saw. Was generation or education, or were there other factors that you just didn't talk about in this talk that are also important to support? And then related to that, about whether or not people are sort of voting with their pocketbook versus looking at sort of the long-term development of China. One thing that I think I've seen a lot with economists talking about inequality in China, and also how people's incomes have grown a lot in the last, say, 10 years. And a lot of that growth is attributed to income or wealth from real estate. And if that's the case, then I wonder if this kind of soft landing theory will actually work, because it's possible that if people's sense of income growth or wealth growth is related to real estate, that could be very fleeting in the event of some kind of, I think the bubble has actually already burst. So I'm just wondering if you have any sense of whether or not real estate is a big factor in income.
Okay. Yeah, two good places to start. One is, besides income, what else contributes to regime support? And the positive factors would be obviously patriotism was another element that talked about. The more anti-foreign sentiments do not have a discernible impact on regime support. So really they're kind of separate types of values, and the people who hold them and the people who, what impact it has on regime support. Confucian values were very weakly tied with that, in part because it's just not as systematic, that their viewpoint is not as systematically shared across society as patriotism. And the fear of instability was also very strong. The more that you're worried that these multiple parties, diverse social groups, public demonstrations, the more that you're worried that these things pose a threat to stability, the more you support the party because you think it's the main block against those things. Party membership is also a predictor, but not a real strong one, which I think is why the party's a little bit worried about who it lets into the party's new members. Not very much. Age definitely is important. The older you are, the more you support the regime. Younger people, being more idealistic perhaps, or more cynical, or just have different experiences, don't have the same level of support that their elders do. The question is, that I can't answer, is whether that is a life cycle issue, that as they get older, they will become more supportive. Or is it a generational change that, 20 years from now, the overall support will be less just because the people with the most support have died off? We'll come back in 20 years and we'll answer that question. But right now, we can with what we have available to us. Education it's one of those curious things that if you measure education in terms of the years of education, or if you measure in terms of what's your highest degree, you get different results. So it's in that sense, it's a little bit unclear exactly what is the best indicator of education, whether years of education or the highest degree that you have. But it's not a clear picture from that either. Age, it may be that age is wiping out the impact of education because younger people tend to be better educated. And remember, this is an urban-only sample, so education to begin with is going to be higher than the countryside as a whole. So I guess each of the things, those contribute to support. What I mentioned about things that we think would really undermine support don't always do so. So just being exposed to censorship doesn't affect your overall level of regime support unless you're angry about it, in which case that does have an impact. So it's not just the treatment, it's not the exposure to censorship, it's your emotional response to it that matters. Now your question about real estate, the question that was in the surveys was intentionally subjective. So we don't ask, how much did you make 5 years ago? How much did you make this year? It's often difficult to really figure out what incomes are. I will say that I was talking with some of the people involved in the China Household Income Project survey, and they found a similar trend that they weren't expecting to find either, that incomes, when it was objectively measured, and they're very meticulous about how they measure income, that incomes were continuing to rise, and their last survey was also in 2014. So I don't think it's just, I don't know how many people get a large part of their income from real estate investments, just because that may be a select group of people, but I don't think that by itself is driving the overall difference between the 2 years and the surveys. Yes?
Could you compare the Chinese communists and the North Korean communists, the way they operate? Which one you crumble first?
I'll give you a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is no, I can't really compare them, in part because we know so little about the North Korean political system. It's really hard to compare. Having said that, the North Korean government is a great example that you don't need any legitimacy at all to survive. And you know, I've have some colleagues who work in Korea who've been doing interviews with people who have emigres from North Korea. And these were people who are prominent in the military and the government. And it's amazing how dependent everybody is on the state, and nobody has an incentive to challenge, and nobody has an incentive to cooperate. And the real puzzle is, despite that high level of repression, despite the poverty, the famine, the hunger, and so on, as far as we can tell, there have been no opposition movements in the country. And yet you would expect, if anyone has reason to be unhappy, it's the North Koreans. But I think they're so intimidated. This is a regime that's so successful at identifying any potential source of opposition and dealing with it very heavy-handedly, that everybody else is just lulled into submission. It is probably a much more fragile system and could collapse much more quickly. And that's, for China's leaders, that's one of their big fears, is that they recognize the situation that's going on in North Korea, and if it collapsed, they're probably going to get a huge flow of refugees across the border into China, which they don't want. And so they're not as eager as the US, Japan, South Korea in putting pressure on North Korea, because they don't want that kind of implosion, and they probably have a better sense of the likelihood of that than other people do.
The way it is so obvious, North Korea is like an inferior court, one-man dictatorship. But the Chinese Communist is a party, so many people. I guess that's why the corruption will happen, because there are so many people.
Right.
But in Korea, I don't know how we are not. It's not transparent.
Right.
How the North Korean operate. How
I have no insight on that. It is the same black box as it is, I guess, for anybody else. Yes.
Well, you've indicated that less than 10% of the population belong to the Communist Party. I'd be interested to know whether more of the Communist Party members live in urban areas, and just how people feel in general toward members of the party. Do they advertise the fact that they are members, or would they rather conceal the fact?
Party membership has always been much more common in the cities than in the countryside, and in the reform era, almost all the growth has come in the cities. There's been very little recruitment in China's villages, in part because the people who have the ambition, who the party would want to recruit, they've migrated somewhere else. And so they may recruit them as migrant workers in cities, but the party organization in the countryside is pretty much a shambles. It is no longer the stigma that it used to be, joining the party or discussing it openly. Even some are reluctant to talk about it outside of China because they realize that, you know, Americans may react to them differently if they knew that they were a party member. But it's not much of a secret. And it used to be that when I would ask students if they were party members, they'd usually kind of either just say no or sort of kind of be evasive. Now the ones who are open about it. But they often don't have real principled reasons for joining. One of my grad students remembers that she and a bunch of her friends were sitting around the dorm one night when they were undergrads, and they decided to fill out an application. And she can't really say why she did, except that all her friends were doing it.
What is the attitude then in general toward members of the party by non-members?
They are less, the rest of the population sees their incentives being much more self-serving than even the party members themselves do. So people who are not in the party think the only reason you join the party is for self-interested reasons. And and most party members nowadays would agree with that. Having said that, though, there's not the same sense that people who are joined the party are necessarily the enemy, that they join the enemy in some way, or that they're tainted in some way by their membership. It's just seen as almost a neutral type of membership that's often, at least within China, it's a little bit more murky abroad because, on college campuses, party members are organized and attend meetings, and it's just not talked about very much because many would be alarmed by that. When Xi Jinping came to DC last fall, there were a couple of students that were not in class that night. And it turned out the embassy had reached out, invited them to be part of the people on the street, clapping their hands and waving flags. And the ones who were party members said yes, and the ones who were not came to class. So the short answer is that it is not a big deal among most of the people that I've talked to about whether or not you're a party member. Especially if you're college educated, the chances are you are a party member. If you have any position of influence in any kind of an organization, banks, schools, factories, you're a party member. So it's just sort of seen as an essential credential to get past otherwise a very low glass ceiling. Yeah.
A couple of questions related to the data. One of the arguments that one hears often with respect to China is that the increasing prosperity of the last 35 years has essentially bought off the middle classes, such that they feel their lives are constantly improving, and so they're not a source of instability. But on the other hand, sometimes people say they have more insecurity about their newfound wealth, too. I was wondering if you could extrapolate from that an argument, a larger argument about the cities, the urban sample that you're taking your data from, because the cities have in the last 20, 30 years pulled away from the countryside as well. So you would expect urban residents to be more satisfied, certainly vis-a-vis the countryside. So how much does your data reflect the fact that cities are disproportionately better off than the countryside? And then the second question, which is related to that, is do you detect any regional variation between, say, first-tier cities and second-tier cities, or north and south, in your answers?
Okay. The second question is easier to answer given the design of the survey, which were prefecture-level cities. And so by definition, these were the provincial capitals, the largest cities. And it was done that way in part to, that's where the party's been devoting most of its attention. So it seemed to, this would be a place to see whether its strategy is working or not. The main regional difference was that cities in central China, not along the coast, not in the northeast, not in the far west, the center of the country, had the lowest levels of support. Now, it may be for the reasons that you identified. They haven't seen the tangible benefits of economic growth and modernization that other regions have. With the Open the West policies, they may feel, again, left out of that rising prosperity. But that area stood out as having lower levels of support than other parts of the country. For the first question about, shouldn't we expect that people who are doing well would be satisfied and supportive? We should. At the same time, there's social science literature that says rising prosperity creates political expectations for change and desire for accountability and so on. The often stated revolution of rising expectations, for which there's almost no evidence of. And so part of it was designed to kind of look at what are the issues that really animate people. What I didn't talk about here, but it gets a lot of coverage in the book, are things about how people assess the environment and food safety and issues of poverty alleviation, housing, and so on. And there you get much more, I'd say people are more disgruntled but not really dissatisfied. In the same way that Americans will complain about the cost of health care and the decline of our schools and the environmental issues, they're much worse in China, but similar discussions take place there as well, without necessarily seeing the solution to those problems being the overthrow of this government and the creation of a new one. So these people who are living in the cities also are seeing some of the downsides of rapid modernization as well, with environmental degradation and the growing food safety scandals now, more recently about vaccines and so on. So the lack of government regulation over these things. But the desire seems to be having the government do a better job of monitoring and regulating these things, not that all hope is lost, we have to start over again. So that may be coming down the road, and as part of this dilemma that I mentioned, that what they're doing now to try and address concerns may in the future create expectations for even more accountability, for even more public assertiveness to influence policy change. But so far, that's just speculated, but not really shown. Yeah.
I'm curious about doing public opinion research in China,
Uh-huh.
partly because you also mentioned that people are suspicious of NGOs, and I expect that to influence your work as well. So that's one question. Does that add an unwelcome variable? Second would be that what's the state's interest? Are they interested in exactly what? Do you have to agree to share your results? And are they doing their own public opinion research? You have to
Believe it or not, that question has been asked before about how reliable this survey data are from China. And I don't want to, undersell it. It is a huge problem, and that's why working with reliable survey teams who know what kind of questions will get you a predictable response, which ones people simply won't answer because it seems too sensitive or too abstract, they really can't answer it. You don't have to get government permission to do survey work at the local level. Foreign scholars cannot be directly involved in it. You have to have a Chinese party that actually does it. They let the local governments know that they're going to be working in the area and broadly what the topic of the survey is. That's often more a informal common sense than really getting permission to do it. And when we go through the design of the questionnaire, a lot of it is this too sensitive? Will we get in trouble? Will people answer it? So there's care in terms of how these things are put into the questionnaire. Do people lie about it? Ken Jennings was another professor here for many years, and he would say that they may be lying, but they're lying in ways that are predicted by social science theory. So unless they know how a middle-aged woman with a college degree should answer this question, which seems a little bit on the face unlikely, there's a certain amount of a degree of, at least a degree of truth to what they're saying. These are not, there is variation and systematic variation in how people respond to things. And we're careful not to ask questions that we know are just off limits. So in the United States, every week we get a new survey about President Obama's approval ratings, how likable or unlikable Hillary and Trump and other people are. You cannot ask about individual leaders in China. It's simply off limits. You cannot ask about certain hot button issues like Tibet and Taiwan and Falun Gong and things like that. So you have to steer clear of things that you know are important, but you know are also not going to get you reliable results. There is a couple questions embedded in it to kind of measure people's level of political fear. And those questions were not correlated with responses on what might be sensitive questions. So recognizing that all these things can doom the credibility of a survey, we tried to be careful about the questions, the wording, and so on. Having said all that, some people may have not been given the full and complete, honest opinions because just as Americans don't always give honest answers when they're asked, would you vote for a racist for president? In fact, they would. So But they're not irrelevant either. They do contain useful information. It's a question of how you use them and how you ask them to begin with. But that is, for anyone doing any kind of survey work in an authoritarian regime like China's, that's the initial question. You have to pass that smell test in order for the rest of it to have any credibility. Yes?
A question about the civil society thing related to NGOs. I was interested in your comment that they're highly not trusted. And I was wondering what the role of NGOs were in China, because I know if you were to talk to people in India about NGOs, it's a career line that people go into and they can't get a job somewhere else. That's one kind of conceptualization. If you're in Africa and you're in Nigeria, you say NGOs, well, it's a way to avoid the government because the government's so corrupt. But I'm not sure, I've had a little bit of contact with NGOs in China, but I was wondering what role they seem to play and why you think they're so highly not trustworthy.
I mean, the people that I know who really focus on NGOs in the course of their research, frown and nod when they hear me say that people don't trust NGOs in China. And the reason for it is in part because, on the one hand, the government is suspicious about them, and even though people don't automatically absorb and repeat what the government has a lot of influence on how people look at things. And the fact that these groups may not have the full blessing of the government makes people suspicious about what they're up to. The ones, especially ones that get international funding for what they do, even more so, because the worry is that they're carrying water for the West instead of benefiting Chinese society. And that viewpoint is very widespread, not just in China, but it was the case in Egypt even before the Arab uprisings. It was that way throughout Central Europe. That people are worried that NGOs are just the stalking horse for the CIA or something else, and are just very suspicious about what they're up to, which is very frustrating for people who are trying to do good. And some of them are. A lot of people in the NGO sector in China are. There's not a lot of, shall we say, professionalization of a lot of NGOs, and they're not very stable. Their staff turn over a lot. They open and close with some regularity. So, all the more reasons for people to sort of be suspicious about what they're up to. But it's not unique to China. That viewpoint seems to be shared. If it wasn't for Tocqueville telling us that this was the basis for stable democracy, I'm not sure it would necessarily seem that way. But we've sort of absorbed that idea that civil society is all things right and good about a society. Other people find that there's plenty of good reason to be suspicious about organized groups that don't have the government's blessing. Yes?
I was intrigued by that same issue about trust. And I can tell you, it rings true to me I've been working as a businessman in China for about 15 years, and businesses don't trust each other. We have supplier partnerships here between customers and suppliers that work very closely, and the Chinese guys I work with just won't do it. But I found another thing intriguing in what you said, that you looked at the comparison of trust levels at different levels of the government, from the national on down to the local, and I believe you said that there was a, relatively speaking, higher level of trust with the upper levels and lower with local. My perception in the U.S. is it's exactly the opposite.
That's right.
Lots of us are delighted with our local officials, and we're happy with our individual congressional rep, and yet we think Congress is awful. So it seems like it's exactly the opposite, and I wonder if you could comment on that.
The reason for it is pretty straightforward. In democracies, we have more, we can see more what local governments are doing. We have more accountability over them, and so we tend to evaluate the work that they do more, especially in a very decentralized, federalized system like in the United States. A lot of what happens is done at the local level, and local leaders often run on blaming Washington as a way of diverting attention from their own problems. In authoritarian regimes where you don't really have the same sense of transparency or accountability, officials are appointed from above, not with any type of popular mandate. People tend to blame them for the problems. In China in particular, the central government will often announce very wonderful sounding policies without providing any resources to local governments to carry them out. And so people blame local governments for either being inept or corrupt for not doing what the center promised. But local leaders see these as being unfunded mandates they have no ability to carry out. Some people have argued that the higher level of trust in the center is a bit like what used to be referred to as the myth of the good czar, that because they were so far away, they were sort of mythical figures that they weren't flesh and blood people, and so you had great trust in them. If only those wise leaders would see what was happening here, surely they would fix these problems. And so that creates this notion of high trust at the center, then at each level, less and less. And that has been the case in every survey I've seen, has been that pattern, but not unique to China. In Vietnam is the exact same pattern, with the center being more trusted than local governments. Democracies, typically, local leaders are valued more than national leaders. In part, it has to do with how they're selected and how society, the degree to which they can be accountable to society. Yes? One more? Okay.
One of the biggest causes for petitions is the issue of land expropriation. It's something we've talked about, but you didn't really talk about how that impinges upon government support. But when you're seeing these surveys that I think it was 37% of villagers who were surveyed said that there'd been land expropriation in their village, that must have an impact on support. Were you able to survey on this particular issue or not? And how do you think it affects support, especially when it's happening so much more in rural areas, which of course
Right.
you didn't survey?
Right. I mean, that's sort of my cop-out, is that given the nature, the design of the survey only at urban areas, and for the most part, these land grabs are really the outer suburban areas or into the rural areas, and so we're not capturing the people who are being most affected by it. Having said that, it's amazing to me that the Chinese government hasn't solved this problem, that local governments, because they are not able to, the state owns the land, so they can't tax it, right? I pay tax on the little land that my house surrounds my house because I ostensibly own it. In China, the government owns the land, and that they can't tax the land. They can only get revenue from it if they sell the rights to it. And so by grabbing them away from people who currently have the rights and reselling it to somebody else, that's a key source of revenue for a lot of local governments. The solution to that is to find other revenue streams for local governments to count on. In the absence of that, it's been difficult to really resolve the issue. And it's a hugely unpopular issue, which makes it all the more puzzling why there hasn't been a more systematic effort to address the problem. For people living in the rural areas or in the very, what you would call exurbia, far reaches, where the city starts to blend into the countryside, that is a huge source of frustration and anger and has led to often very violent clashes as a result. For whatever reason, the central government, wags the finger and says, you shouldn't do that, but don't really crack down on it because local governments are already starved for revenue to begin with. Rightly or wrongly, this has become one of their alternative sources of revenue. Without sort of changing the entire fiscal system, they're left with a very unpopular policy. It's illegal, everyone recognizes it's illegal, and yet very widespread.
But when it comes to your research, what you're saying is there are large pockets of discontent that you've been unable to capture because of the design of the research and the sensitivity of the issue. Is that correct?
It is. People who looked at the land grab issue, one of the most interesting studies I've seen has been about how people respond to the settlement that they get from the local governments. that if you get a lump sum, a one-time lump sum, you tend to spend it all, often in Macau or somewhere else, and then you come back to the government and say, okay, I need more money, I'm out. And the government says, we already gave you your money, you're done. And then you have ongoing conflict. If you get a dividend every year, an annuity of the value of your lands, so it kind of subsidizes what else you're doing to get income, those people tend to be more satisfied with the outcome and at least more acceptant of it. So it's not just the land grabs, it's also how the local government gives its admittedly inadequate compensation to people. If it's a lump sum, it tends to create more conflict. If it's done as an annuity, it seems to alleviate some of those concerns. So they're still doing the land grabs, but how they're compensating people helps determine whether or not people are dissatisfied or whether they are willing to acquiesce in the outcome. So in that sense, there is some flexibility and some innovativeness at the local level in how to deal with it. But I guess that's about all I can say about it, because they were sort of outside the scope of this project. Yeah.
I'm going to stop there because it's 5:30, but I want
Okay.
to thank you.
Thank you.